This is Joseph Giacobelli. I'm an analyst, investor, author, and the host of the Asia Climate Finance podcast, which is a philanthropic series dedicated to the promotion of knowledge and discussion on sustainable finance in Asia, from the perspective of the business of decarbonization and the energy transition in the region, which consumes about half of the world's energy and electricity. Please support this effort by liking and by subscribing to the podcast. Hello there, and welcome to the Asia Climate Finance Podcast, episode 29 today. And we have a very, very exciting guest who's actually was our very first guest for the podcast on episode 2 in March last year. It is Mark Hutchinson. Mark is a proven leader in the energy transition space. He's been working with companies, governments, and other stakeholders to enable the move to a carbon-free future. He's advised on billions of dollars of renewable energy sector acquisitions, financing, IPOs, and other types of capital raising. And today we're talking about offshore wind. Now, offshore wind generation capacity is one of the fastest growing forms of green energy globally. It will rise tenfold this decade based on one estimate and will need tens of billions of dollars. Mark is one of Asia's leading veteran experts in the energy sector in general and clean energy in particular. In our conversation, we first discussed the current state of the US and European offshore wind markets. We then deep dive into the current state as well as the outlook for offshore wind in some of the key jurisdictions around the Asia-Pacific region, including Japan and South Korea, for example, as well as markets which are offering enormous potential for growth, including India, the Philippines, and Vietnam. In addition to the business opportunity, Mark also shares some very interesting thoughts on financing trends. I hope you enjoy the show. Hi, as I mentioned, this is episode 29th of the Asia Climate Finance podcast. And today we have a very dear friend of mine and someone I really highly respect in terms of opinions whenever anything to do with clean energy, Mark Hutchinson. Hello, Mark. How are you?
I'm good today. Thanks, Joseph, for having me.
No, thank you very much for making the time. I know you're in between a whole bunch of trips around Asia. And so I really appreciate the time and looking forward to your insights. So as we discussed, today we're going to be talking about global offshore wind in general, but in particular Asia. So just because you were back on the podcast on the middle of March of last year, so I think people can go back and listen to some of your views back then. But before we get into that, maybe you can just remind our listeners very, very briefly about what you're up to now. Where you work and what you do.
Okay, sure. So my name is Mark Hutchinson. I'm a director in the Asia team for the Global Wind Energy Council, or GWEC. We are the largest global trade organization covering the wind industry, all the major developers, almost all of the major OEMs, a lot of supply chain companies and others are our members. And, we work with our members, multilateral organizations, wind associations in various countries to really help governments and other stakeholders, understand more about the wind industry. And, we bring them together in a lot of forums. Our general view is dialogue and information sharing and building understanding through listening is really the way to kind of advance the needs of offshore wind and get the world decarbonizing faster than it is now.
You may also want to mention, Mark, the report which just came out, hot off the press, and where maybe our listeners can get it from.
Certainly. So every year around this time, we release the Global Wind Report, and this is our flagship report where it contains a lot of data on the wind market historically and our projections. But it also, contains every year sort of key themes that we see that are challenges for the industry. So this year, we have two key themes. One of them is supply chain, because I think the last few years have really shown how challenging supply chain issues can be in the industry. Of course, the war in Ukraine has kind of put even further challenges into those supply chains. Concentration in China of the high tech and clean energy supply chains also a bit of an issue. And then the other key point that we're trying to make is 2022 was not a great year for wind and for offshore wind. And the reason for that is a lot of the implementation issues, the permitting issues, and just getting grid connections, moving up in the
Mm,
queue on an auction, dealing with marine spatial planning and trade-offs between defense exclusion zones, fisheries, bringing in local communities. All of these have been challenging to get sort of agreement among all the various stakeholders. And so, wind industry saw fewer installations last year by a fairly significant amount compared to both 2020 and 2021.
mm, mm,
And
mm, mm.
these are implementation issues that, take a lot of work to get through, the various bureaucracies, and get regulations and policies put in place to kind of help things speed up. Otherwise, there's no chance of us reaching sort of, these decarbonization goals that so many government companies have.
Great. I mean, that's a great kind of mini executive summary of the report. Can we get into the current state, or at least looking backward at 2022, of the first we can talk about the rest of the world, ex Asia, and the global kind of trends there, which I guess probably Europe is in the driver's seat there, and then after that we can kind of talk specifically about the kind of business trends in general in Asia. Could we do that?
Yeah, sure. So, globally, there's lots of great targets. The Inflation Reduction Act in the US is really catalyzing, change and development there. It's still going to take a few years before there's a lot of, turbines spinning in the ocean, but things are moving very, very quickly. The US is an exceptional market today. Europe has lots of plans and lots of targets, but I think it's where implementation is really hitting a lot of challenges. So, the EU really wants to wean itself from Russian gas and the reliance on coal that kicked in after the invasion of Ukraine, but they're still struggling with really you know, everywhere from, grid queues and grid connections to, permitting and all sorts of things like that. So it's down to the very nitty-gritty. There's plenty of great targets. It's just the implementing rules and regulations that as you get deeper down into it. China, of course, uh, was is a huge offshore wind market. Um, and things are moving across the rest of Asia, with Philippines, Vietnam, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, India, and even Australia. So lots of great moves and momentum, but we just need to install more turbines.
Um, two quick follow-up questions, Mark, if I could. One, you said the US is an exceptional market, and could you kind of explain that for those of us who are not as familiar with that particular market? And B, with regards to these kind of execution or implementation problems in Europe, now that there's a new momentum with caused a lot by the US announcing the IRA, and now Europe reacting to that. Do you see those execution problems in Europe perhaps improving? I mean, have you heard? I mean, right now, or did you see anything in 2022 which tells you that things are improving? So those two questions.
Okay, so just briefly on the IRA. The IRA is a huge act. There's too many things to summarize, but in effect, it provides a series of different tax credits: investment tax credit, production tax credit, a whole bunch of other sort of credits that make it quite attractive to invest in clean technology. And it's not just wind; it's battery storage, it's electric vehicles,
Mm,
infrastructure. So it's everything. It's a massive game changer. And one of the things that it's doing is it's causing a lot of the global developers and even the OEMs to kind of repurpose and refocus on North America, because now that you've got this fairly clear policy certainty with sort of clear implementing rules and regulations, there is a bit of a danger that a lot of the developers and OEMs who are looking and are currently working in some of the more challenging markets might actually refocus some of their efforts into the US. So that's something that a lot of markets need to really think about, because
mm,
if say, for example, I don't really want to pick on a particular country, but say a country that's a little challenging, more challenging these days, doesn't try to move a little bit faster, the attention of the developers and the OEMs will switch, because they have a certain amount of capital, they have a certain amount of human skills and human capital, and they will focus it where they can achieve the most. Um, the If we switch to Europe, the challenges in Europe, I wish I was really positive on it. I'm not super positive. There was a lot of talk. And I think 2022 was the year that everybody in Europe realized, wow, we've really got to streamline this process, the permitting, the environmental permits, et cetera, because otherwise we're going to be, reliant on, LNG and coal for far too long into the future. So I think the Europeans are still kind of working on all these implementing rules and regulations, but there is a much more of a sense of urgency now than there was 6 or 8 months ago. So some positive.
mm, mm. Just to pick, just to be the devil's advocate on the US, right? So you've got, so the IRA comes out, everybody gets really excited, lots of hope. Actually, some things are getting implemented. I'm aware of that. But given that, and in this program, we don't talk about politics because I'm completely clueless, and I think anybody who can accurately forecast elections or politics is probably a god. But given that there's an election in 2024, and given that the other party, the Republicans, are not exactly totally in love with everything to do with climate change and renewable energy, if there is, I mean, is there a danger that a lot of people are thinking, and I'm talking about the developers, manufacturers, etc., saying, well, it's great that the US has got this policy, but we're not really sure it is going to be another U-turn in 2 years. So is that a concern or not?
Uh, so I am a U.S. citizen, not a U.S. resident. I've been in Asia 29 years, so I'm not super up on what's happening in the U.S. But I think what you're seeing now is there is so much investment pouring into local communities, ports,
Mm, mm,
factories, human skills development, that if the Republicans do win both houses and the presidency in 2024, um, pulling the plug on this, you know, would be pretty devastating. And so what you're going to find then is you're going to find a lot of economic interests, states' interests that will
mm,
push
mm, mm,
very
mm,
hard
mm.
against that. So I think it's one of those things where, by 2025, when the Republicans would be consolidating the power, should they win both houses and the presidency, there's probably going to be a little bit too much momentum already, and with job creation, economic development, and etc. So I would
Right,
wait and see.
right. Right. No, no, that's a great answer, and I do appreciate that you're not a U.S. politics expert, despite the fact that you're from originally from the U.S. But thank you very, very much for that. Now that we've talked about kind of like the two big markets, U.S. And Europe, let's move to the biggest market, which accounts for 50% of global energy consumption, Asia. And in these countries, I think you've identified places like Australia, India, Korea, Japan, and Vietnam, and the Philippines as some of
Taiwan,
the key markets. Oh, and Taiwan.
Taiwan,
Um,
China.
yeah. Yeah, good point. So could we perhaps talk a little bit about the state of these different markets? Because some of them, like, you've seen quite a bit of momentum already for some time in, I believe, China, Korea, and Japan, and to some extent Vietnam, and some other markets are kind of like gradually catching up. Could you tell us a little bit about the status of each of these markets?
Um, Certainly. So again, the biggest market would be China for offshore by a margin, huge, huge, huge margin. They had a big bump in 2021. It's went down in 2022 just because there were some expiring incentives. So 2022 numbers will be smaller for China. But again, they see it before it will actually start growing again. But it's a quite closed market. It's dominated as China is in many industries by local, very capable developers and OEMs who will increasingly, by the way, look to expand overseas as they already have for the onshore.
Mm.
Then there's a very big drop between China and the next market. The next, markets that have any scale would be Taiwan. Um, and Taiwan was a pioneer in ex-China, markets in Asia for offshore wind. It's had a few bumps in the last couple of years, but still is the second largest market for offshore wind. Then the next ones are really Korea and Japan, and they're having a little bit of a race. I was in Korea last week, and I got quoted in the press saying that Korea will be the second largest offshore wind market in Asia by 2030. I really actually think that's more like the early 2030s. I think it will overtake Taiwan. Korea is really wanting to move forward. It's a peninsula, effectively an island because of North Korea. No hydrocarbon resources of much scale, so they import almost all their energy. As with a lot of Asia, there's serious land constraints, so they can't do onshore wind at big scale. Even they can't do onshore utility scale solar because, again, the land constraints. So unless they're going to be buying hydrogen from, Australia sometime in the future, they've got to do offshore wind. And there's a growing
Mm.
realization in Korea that that's the case. So I think, you're seeing a lot of movements in the National Assembly, and there's a couple bills there that are likely to move forward that are relatively supportive of the industry. Japan's moving. Japan's kind of a bit slower moving, I think, than Korea, but they've already run one quite large auction. They've got a number of demonstration projects, and they're, thinking of running another auction later this year. So they're definitely moving. True large scale installations are probably, completions are probably still at least 3 years away in Japan. Um, let's see. Then we move into the market: India, Vietnam, Philippines, and Australia. None of whom have any large scale offshore wind. Vietnam has some nearshore wind, which is less than 3 kilometers offshore. They're really just in mud flats, so we don't
Mm.
really count that as offshore. But they have quite good wind. All those countries have very good wind. So the first thing you need to do is check the resource. And Vietnam has some big targets for wind, 7 gigawatts by 2030. Although Vietnam a little bit challenging on the policy front, as the Power Development Plan 8 has not yet been passed, so things are moving a little bit slowly there, even though they have committed to net zero by 2050. Philippines is something that has really changed in the last year. Since the new president and now the new Secretary of Energy, the Philippines is moving forward very rapidly. We've had 4 workshops with the government in the last year. I've been there twice for workshops already. This year, I'll be going again in a few weeks. Uh, I'm super impressed with how quickly the government is moving there. So that's definitely a place to watch. And if you're in the offshore wind industry and you're not looking at the Philippines, you really should. Um, Australia has surprised people quite a bit in the last few years. Again, they have great onshore wind and great solar, but they also have pretty good offshore wind, and so that's been
Mm.
accelerating. quite rapidly. We're having a big event there in August. So go to gwec.net and take a look, and you'll see that event. It'd be great to see some of you there. And then I'm headed to India on Sunday, where again the offshore wind off Tamil Nadu, the state of Tamil Nadu, is accelerating forward. And yeah, that's a very quick rundown of Asia. But things are very much changing here, and I think there's a lot of excitement about what offshore wind can deliver for those countries that have the resource.
No, because I've given you an easy time so far, given that this is a subject that you're very, very familiar with. I'm going to ask you the tough question, which is, what about the policy backdrop? I mean, we've seen, for example, in Japan, there was a lot of talk, but then when it came to execution, I think at the beginning when they announced the offshore targets, a lot of observers said, "Oh, probably they're gonna surpass those targets much earlier than the 2030, but then 2030." But for a whole bunch of reasons, it's been a little bit slower. And now you've got the Koreans that are kind of catching up very, very quickly. So could you give us a little bit about the policy kind of backdrop, at least in Korea and Japan, and elsewhere, of course?
Yeah, I mean, so let's be clear. Most countries set targets that they probably can't meet and probably won't meet. There's always good intentions behind it, but the politicians set it, and then it becomes the job of the ministries, the bureaucrats, the regulators to actually implement it. And that's I just like what we talked about earlier. That's where the challenge is. So it's all the supporting policies and regulations, pretty much in every country. That is where we work. And so what we do, you have, the PM or the president or whatever, the secretary or the minister of energy or whatever, gets up at a COP and makes an announcement. Then they go home and then they hand it over to their bureaucrats and their ministries. And that's kind of where it's all falling down, because the sense of urgency doesn't really seep down. The other challenge, I think, is, I mean, it's stating the obvious, but anytime a country does offshore wind, they're doing it for the first time. And it's a big, complicated industry with massive scale of investment. So there's certainty that's needed from government policy, and also the financing, right? In places like Vietnam or the Philippines, you're probably going to have to bring in international finance. So again, you need additional policy clarity, regulatory clarity. And again, that's where things just fall down a little bit and slow down the implementation. So policy right now is where we at GWEC spend a huge amount of time just bringing together stakeholders, providing case studies of best practice. I literally, just before this call, I was on another internal call where we were trying to figure out, for Korea, for example, what's the best case study countries to look at as they transition from a developer-led process to a more centralized government-led process.
If I can put it this way, and as you know me quite well, I don't necessarily explain things very clearly, but in Europe, it feels like you've got the European authorities, the EU authorities saying we're going to go green. Let's go 100% an hour, 100%, 100 kilometers an hour if we can, and it's almost like a triangle block. But then they're trying to put this triangle into a smaller, I don't know, rectangular block, so to speak. What I mean by that is on the implementation, they have to go to the local governments who already got a more cumbersome process of approval, et cetera, et cetera. So nothing basic. A lot of stuff doesn't get done, and I've seen it here in Portugal. I've seen it in Italy. In France, there may be a new lobby that says oh, we don't want the wind turbine offshore there because it disturbs the view, and we're going to have to review it for the next 3 years. And I think the approval from approval to completion offshore wind farms in Europe, the average is something like 7 to 14 years or something ridiculous like that.
Yes, probably
Yeah.
not the upper end, but in general, we say 6 to 8 years.
And then the Koreans, the Koreans, in my experience, are actually quite good at sorting that problem out. Is a much better conduit from the kind of federal government, central government to the local governments. Seems a little bit more fluid. Whereas Japan is a little bit more like Europe, the localized. The very local government, county government, district governments have got their own kind of set of rules, regulations, processes, and that slows things down. Am I accurate in your experience about what I'm saying in a very cumbersome way?
Yeah, yeah. I mean that's the challenge we're facing in the industry now. It's not,
Mm-mm.
it's not the big plans, it's not the targets. It's all this very detailed, local consenting, permitting, EIAs. You know, um, are we interrupting, mammal habitat? Or is there a bird migration issue? Is there like a bird migration route that goes right through where the proposed wind farm is? Is the area used for defense exercises, every 5 years? All of, is there a shipping channel nearby? All of these things kind of need to get sorted. Some countries are more advanced on that than others.
Mm-mm.
But it's always a challenge to kind of put all of those together and say, yes, this is where wind can go. This is where fisheries, this is where we have ecotourism. This is where we have shipping channels. This is defense exclusion zones, etc.
And still talking about policy, what about the whole kind of auction versus long-term PPA and corporate PPA situation in the Asia Pacific region? Where are we at? I mean, what's the developments on that front?
Um, my general view, and I think the industry's general view, is the corporate PPA method is the way to go for the future. If you look at North American market, European market, Australian market, Indian market, corporate PPAs are a key enabler. That's not happening in a lot of the other Asian countries, either like in like in Vietnam, you can't do it yet. It's just regulatorily not possible. In the Philippines, you can. Japan, you can. Taiwan, you can. Korea, you can't yet. So I think that is the way of the future, because what that does is that takes government out of the commercial negotiations, which is I think there's always it's challenging for governments to, for example, do feed-in tariffs, because somebody can, after they're awarded, people can say to the government, those were too generous. You shouldn't have done that. But if it's a corporate PPA, the government is not involved in commercial terms, setting the price or anything. And so it's very difficult to second guess the government. The next best solution that I think governments see is the auction, as you mentioned. So auctions, again, there's price discovery. It's usually fairly transparent. And nobody can accuse the government of favoritism or
Mm.
overpaying, although that still happens to a certain extent. A challenge that's happening now in some of the auctions is that there are these non-price criteria. And when these non-price criteria come in, if they're not transparent enough, then that can be seen as a way for governments to favor one entity over another. And so our general preference is for a fairly, if there's a scoring system, a fairly high level of scoring, say 60 or 70% would go to price criteria, and then maybe 30 or 40% would go to non-price criteria, like how much local content do you have? What is your plan for investing in the communities? Things like that.
And you mentioned that you see already evidence of corporate PPAs in Taiwan, Japan, Philippines, but not yet in Korea as well as Vietnam, right? About
It's just because there's no legal structure in Korea or Vietnam.
Got it. Got it. Cool. And I guess now we want to talk about a little bit on the outlook side of things, which is, I guess, part of the GWEC report that just came out, which looks at 2022, but also tries to put in some ideas as to where things are going. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
So the way, if you look at the life cycle of an offshore wind project, you already said that it takes quite a while. So say 6 to 8 years. So a lot of the development activity has to take place up front. So it takes roughly 3 years, sometimes 2-something years to construct. So if you think it takes 8 years, walk backwards, that means it's not until year 5 or 6 that you start construction. So if you want to talk about the actual deployment of the money, if something changes in 2023 as far as regulations, the massive deployment of money isn't really going to happen until a few years later when these projects reach construction. So while we're actually quite positive on the future, 2023 is probably not going to be a great year, but we actually see it as a tipping point where I think governments and industry kind of see the need to make these implementing rules and regulations more streamlined, and then the investment really will flow in the following years. So 2023 has the potential to be a not particularly great year for offshore wind. But if you're not participating in the wind industry now, right, because of the very long lead times, the relationships that it takes to build, collecting wind data for 2 years, so you have a fully bankable project. You need to be involved today. Actually, you need to be involved last year and the year before to get your project online by 2027, for example.
I guess that's been one of the, what do you call it, investment risks for financial investors, whether it's a private equity fund or other, because you need to start funding the studies, et cetera, which I believe are not that cheap. It's not desktop research.
Yeah, tens of millions. I mean, if you're going to be doing a 1 gigawatt offshore wind project, you're spending tens of millions of dollars, on wind measurements, subsurface geotechnical analysis, bird studies, mammal studies, fish studies, grid impact studies. Yes, it's not for the faint of heart.
So then, if I'm an investor, there's all that money up front, which I need to spend regardless. And then, I start looking at, putting it up, et cetera. And the whole thing takes at least 5 years before I start construction. I don't know, 5 or 6 years. So do you see that less investor appetite in offshore wind versus, say, onshore and solar, or is just the opportunity so big that it's just so attractive that people are still willing to take that particular investment risk?
Yes, absolutely. There is a type of company that can take the risks in offshore wind, and they tend to be, as you might imagine, quite large companies that have done it before. And these companies understand the long process, and it doesn't mean they don't get frustrated at the slow pace, but it's a very different kind of company. Onshore wind tends to be much more local developer driven because the projects are 50 or $100 million, whereas a small offshore wind project is $1 billion and a big one is $7 or $10 billion. So you generally get different players and different risk profiles. But both, I think, onshore wind is growing very rapidly as well. So there's room for a lot of different players, depending on your risk appetite and your capabilities.
And based on your, discussions with, various people and other industry experts, etc., was there more appetite from financial investors to invest in offshore wind in 2022 versus say 21 or 2020? Do you see, in other words, do you see an acceleration in investment appetite?
Yeah. So, for example, you don't typically see PE funds in offshore wind because it just
Mm,
takes so long, and they're generally not a particularly patient investor. You There are some funds that are in offshore wind, but it's mostly the large development companies that are in offshore wind. And what they do is, similar to a lot of business models in the power sector in general, or large capital projects in general, is the closer you get to commercial online date COD, the more likely you are to start some process of selling it down. So there are some developers that build and hold. There are some
mm,
that build, sell it down to get a developer's premium, and then recycle that capital. And then what they do is they sell it to pension funds or investment funds once the project has been substantially de-risked, because those types of funds don't generally like to get into early stage development where it's 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 years before you actually have cash flow.
mm, 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 mm. And on the other side of the financing is the actual lending. And you have, I guess, three pockets. One is the multilaterals like Asia Development Bank, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, etc. Then you have those international banks that will do international loans, and then you've got the local banks. As far as I'm aware, and please confirm or deny my thoughts here. One is that there's been an acceleration on the part of the multilaterals in terms of their interest in supporting offshore wind. I'm not so sure about the international banks as well as the local banks, especially in those markets that we talked about, like Australia, India, Korea, Japan, Vietnam, etc.
Yeah, first of all, there's absolutely no shortage of capital um, looking to fund these projects. Anybody that tells you that, yeah, well, there's plenty of capital out there chasing these projects. What there is a shortage of is projects, and I hate to sound like a lawyer sometimes, but projects that are bankable, projects that exist in a robust regulatory structure, have viable off takers, um, and are generally de-risked, through good wind measurements, all the development activities, etc. If those are done properly, there is plenty of money out there. So in a place like Vietnam or India or Philippines, then you'll probably have some involvement of the multilaterals. In
Mm,
places like Australia or Korea or Japan, you probably don't need them because the capital markets in those countries are pretty advanced. And once the regulatory structure is appropriately sorted out, it's generally de-risked. So it varies by market, but
mm.
there's plenty of money chasing these projects if these projects can exist within a robust regulatory structure, which is not yet the case in some of the countries, which is what we spend a huge amount of our time trying to remedy.
I think it's a really, really great point, Mark, because a lot of people talk about, oh, projects have to be bankable, which means projects have to be good, quote unquote, and they don't really define what a good offshore project is. At the end of the day, like you emphasize, it's really the policy framework around it, the uh, executed government policy, so to speak, as opposed to government wishful thinking or general broad targets that makes the difference. So, in short, or in summary, I should say, in terms of offshore wind projects, your investment outlook, not on a 1 year basis, because you did mention that 2023 is probably more of a tipping point. a year, let's call it a year of transformation, or what about for longer term investors or on a 3 to 5 year view? How do you look at that from your crystal ball?
I'm extremely positive because there is an inevitability to this, right? Because these countries have to decarbonize. They are facing political pressure from international supply chains. They're facing political pressure from the large multinational corporates who are insisting that their supply chains decarbonize. So, to me, I think most of these governments kind of get it. They're still kind of working through all of these, conflicts of interest, potential, turf battles between the various ministries or whatever, trying to sort out all of those implementation details. But I think the 3 to 5 year outlook is very positive. That's when you're going to start to see a lot of financial closes. You're going to see, turbine foundations being put in the water at a much greater rate, and you're going to see the industry really starting to thrive. One of the key points is as it grows, the industry is definitely going to be moving from a buyer's market to a seller's market, because you're going to see the demand on the supply chain for wind to be increased. And then you're going to start to see some of the changing dynamics. So this race to the bottom of lower and lower and lower prices is probably going to take a pause, and you're going to start to see these OEMs and others start to return to healthy profit, because last year most of the OEMs lost money, the major Western OEMs. So it was a challenging year, and even some of the developers, were facing some challenges. But we see that all really doing an about face this year, and shovels in the ground over the next few years, or in the seabed.
Shovels in the seabed. Great. So there was maybe a couple of markets that I would love to hear your views on. One is the Philippines, because, like you said, and as we all seen, or at least those of us who are observing the market, one is the Philippines, and the other one is a market where actually not much is happening, which is Indonesia. So could you tell us what are your thoughts on the Philippines first?
Sure. The Philippines is, as I said, the president, when he came into power last year, uh, came in during the mid-year last year, so during the Ukraine crisis, and he was seeing electricity prices like skyrocket because the imported coal was being passed through the PPA pass-through price mechanisms. So the consumers were really, really getting hit very, very hard.
Mm,
And he did come in with a promise to increase renewables, and so probably that also helped accelerate his thinking, shall we say. And then he hired a secretary of energy who had been a previous secretary of energy to hit the ground running. And they have relaxed foreign ownership restrictions. They've increased the renewable portfolio standard from 1% a year increase to 2.5% a year, and really
mm,
done a lot of various rules and regulations that have given the industry a lot of confidence that things are really going to move forward. They
mm,
ran a
mm,
2,000 megawatt renewable energy auction in June of last year. The numbers that are being thrown around for the June auction this year are 4 to 5,000 megawatts. That's across
mm,
all technology, and we think that offshore wind will be included in that Philippine auction in 2025. So again, just a whole confluence of things came together to make the market move and build confidence in that market. So I'm very positive about it. Indonesia is easy to answer because they don't have very good wind, and so
mm,
there's not a lot of focus on offshore wind right now. If anybody wants to check their market, they can go to Google and look for Global Wind Atlas, And then you can download all these pretty pictures that shows how good wind is in your country or region.
That's great. That's great. Um, Mark, this has been fantastic. Very, very comprehensive as always. Do you have any kind of final thoughts to share?
I'm very positive, as you can tell. There's been a bit of frustration over the last year, though, and I'm sure there'll be some frustration this year as we work with these governments to try to remove the bottlenecks. But I think that the governments are finally seeing that they need to do something. They need to move, and they need a good guidance, and I think international best practice. And I think we're going to see the industry look back in 5 years and say 2022, 2023 was really the tipping point.
Fantastic. Once again, Mark, thank you very, very much for sparing part of your evening with the Asia Climate Finance podcast. And I'm looking forward to do this again. Who knows, maybe this time next year again.
Great. Thanks for having me, Joseph.
Thanks again. I hope you did enjoy this episode of the Asia Climate Finance podcast. I would really appreciate any feedback, topic ideas, etc. My contact is in the show notes. Thank you.